Now we get to move into the real fun part of this evaluation, where I get to compare directly the 2021 GR Supra to the 2020 GR Supra. The red is the 2021 and the white is 2020. We're going to take them out on the exact same road, and I will tell you exactly what the differences are in terms of ride and handling and the overall performance, including the engine feel, the ride and the comfort, and the noise and everything else. So this is really exciting part of evaluation. So let me take you through first the 2020 GR Supra, which is a white one on the left. I'll give you a full report on that, followed by the 2021 GR Supra, which is a red one on the right. And I will compare the two on the road and show you the differences. Let's take a look. So now it's time to do a very interesting review. I'm going to be doing a thorough comparison in terms of ride and handling and the overall performance between the 2021 GR Supra and the 2020 GR Supra. So first, I'm in the 2020 version, which is the first year that this generation has come out. So let's start up the engine and see how this one performs. And then we'll jump into the 21 version and compare the two. So let's fire up the engine. So I've got mine programmed. This is actually my personal car, the 2020 Supra. So I've got this one programmed to start in sport mode. There's a way to do that actually, because normally it starts up in a normal mode and you have to push the button to shift into sport. But anyway, when you do start in sport mode, the exhaust is first thing you notice about the GR Supra. Wonderful, beautiful exhaust sound with a little bit of crackle and pops. And you don't get as much of that in the new 21 model. They really toned down the exhaust sound. So that's one thing that I would miss if I were to change the 2020 Supra to a 2021 model. So right off the bat, when you start the engine, beautiful engine sound. And then as you start to move and drive, of course, the first thing you notice is that the GR Supra, because it's got such a tight package, and the chief engineer Tada-san did everything he can to make this as pure of a sports car as possible. And so a very tight turning radius, short wheelbase, everything was focused on increasing the steering feel, improve the ride and handling over a normal coupes, and generally speaking, to give this car the best handling it can. Now I can tell you there's some interesting things to point out. First of all, about this particular GR Supra, and that is that the overall driving and the feel is fantastic. I mean, I would rate it right up there with some of the best sports cars because it's got a very sharp and a clear steering feel. So what I mean by that is that when you're driving the GR Supra, the steering effort isn't all that high, so it doesn't feel heavy like in some sports cars, but it's more like an Alfa Romeo or Porsche feel. It's light, reasonably light, but very quick. You can move the steering wheel left to the right and kind of wiggle it, and it has a really fast, quick response. It kind of reminds me of the original Acura NSX when it first came, and it was back to basic, and that car had amazing steering feel. So this car is much like that. And I just stepped on the gas a little bit now, but as you can tell, immense acceleration also. Of course, the 2021 model has much more horsepower, 47 more horsepower to be exact, but the 2020 model is no slouch. More than enough acceleration, 0 to 60 in just about 4 seconds, and the 21 model is just 0.2 seconds faster apparently. But acceleration wise, they're both literally identical and both very good. So back to the steering feel. If I were to move the car like this a little bit, wiggle it, the steering response is immediate. So you turn to the right or left quickly like this, and the car moves. The nose of the car moves left and right away, and you don't get that in a lot of the sports car because they've built in kind of softer feel with the heavy steering. So the steering feels heavy, but it's actually not all that fast to move around. So Tada-san, the chief engineer, did a really great job of making sure this Supra has a very pure steering feel. Now, having said that, if I were to compare to some of the best sports car, and I would name the Porsche 911 and 718 Cayman as the best handling sports cars in the world, then this BMW-based Supra is slightly off. And what I mean by that is that right off the center, when you turn the steering at first, there's a bit of a numb feeling right off the center, just initially. And that numb feeling is non-existent in the Porsche. Porsche has a great steering effort and a feel right off the bat, regardless of which direction you're pointing the steering. So, but in comparison to say Infiniti Sports Coupe or Nissan Z or the Jaguar F-Type, this car has much better steering feel and a faster steering response. And as I mentioned in part 1, which talks about the sound exhaust, the exhaust sound on the 2020 model is amazing. It's got a great sound, lots of crackles and pops. Sometimes we call it farting or a burble. It has plenty of that sound coming through the exhaust, and you can hear that loud and clear. Now, I know there is a bit of artificial sound coming through the speaker to enhance the exhaust sound, but actually not as much as you think. It's still pretty, most of the sound we hear from the exhaust is actually quite mostly the actual engine or the exhaust sound you're hearing. So in terms of the overall steering feel, the general handling is top notch. Not quite as good as a Porsche models, better than most of other sports cars. Now, I've also driven the BMW Z4. We call it Z in Canada. In the US, we call it Z or Z4. But the BMW version, which is supposed to be very similar to this car, is not quite the same. Now, the BMW Z4 has slightly heavier steering feel, so it does make you feel like it's sportier, but it's not necessarily sportier. And I found the BMW tuning and the refinement to be lacking in comparison to the Supra. Toyota did an amazing job of refining and just making the steering and the overall ride and handling first class, and you can really see that the engineer did an amazing job of that. I think it handles slightly more accurate than the BMW version, and not as twitchy. The BMW, I found out the Z4 is a bit sensitive and twitchy, whereas the Supra is slightly more forgiving. Having said that, the two cars are based on the same platform and same chassis, so it's 80 to 85% identical in terms of overall feel. The engine on the Supra is amazing, even without upgrades for the 2021. This current version, the 2020 version, has plenty of power and torque, and this is the biggest difference between a pure sports car like this compared to let's say a sports sedan or sportier coupes, because you don't get this immediate response. In the Supra, you step on the gas and the response is immediate, and you're literally pushed back to your back of your seat. You don't quite get that in the sportier coupes that are not a true sports car. I will say that the Germans do a really good job in general, though, in terms of ride and handling. Let me just push the accelerator a little bit more here as well. Yeah, lots of torque to pull you through. Anyway, so as I was saying, the Germans in general do a really good job. I particularly like the Audi TT. The overall feel of that car is very clean. But the Supra, again, has a kind of a pure feel that is lacking in some other competitors' cars. I would still say the Porsche is a benchmark. Now, let's, in terms of ride, by the way, again, this is where Toyota and I think BMW both took took time to make sure that the ride is very reasonable. Sometimes these sports cars are very harsh riding, and because it's so harsh riding that you know, they're not usable as a day-to-day car. They're just too bumpy and too rough. But here I'm going through some bumps here on this Supra, and surprisingly comfortable. It's firm, it's tight, but over bumps and so forth, it is completely manageable. I don't feel that it's too rough and too edgy to drive as a day-to-day car. This car is completely drivable as a day-to-day car. The ride is surprisingly comfortable, and you know, the choice of the tire, Michelin's tires that Toyota picked, BMW and Toyota have the same tires, are also excellent. They're good rain tires, they're good summer tires. Although I will say that if you want to drive this day to day, it's not the best car to drive in heavy rain or in a slightly colder winter conditions. You will really have to put winter tires because there's so much torque and power, and the way that the traction control is calibrated, when you step on the gas, the back end loses out quite easily. So now let's take a look and drive in the 2021 GR Supra and compare it directly in terms of ride, handling, and overall performance. So now I'm in 2021 GR Supra, and we're going to take this guy for a spin and do a direct comparison in terms of the ride and handling and the overall performance, and see how the two compare. So let me start up the car first. Now I managed to start this in sport mode as well, and of course you don't get the same crackles and pops and the farting sound that you get on the 2020. So as I mentioned before, right off the bat, the exhaust sound is more tame in the 21 model, and that's the first thing I noticed. But let's take it for a drive. I have actually been driving this car for a number of days against the 2020 model, and I can highlight some of the differences. Now right off the bat, I know everyone talks about the fact that the 21 model has more horsepower, and that's the one number that everyone seems to be focusing on. But I can tell you, in general drive, even if you were to drive it a little bit aggressively, it is not noticeable. And partly because the 21's increased 47 increased horsepower comes at a higher RPM. So in an everyday drive, and maybe even partly because the exhaust is quieter, it's not as noticeable. You're gonna have to be in a test track or race track and drive it back to back to really notice that 0.2 second difference between the 2020 model and the 2021 model under full acceleration. Otherwise, honestly, the two feel surprisingly similar in terms of the engine performance and the engine feel. But there is some difference in the steering feel. On the new 21 model, the steering has a little bit more heft, a little bit more feeling to it. I don't mean the 2020 model has no feeling. It's just the 21 model has a slightly better steering effort. So it's, I would say it's a tiny bit heavier, maybe like 4 to 5% heavier than the 20 model. And when you turn the steering like this, off center, the reaction is also slightly faster than the 20 model. So the 21 model, as a summary, has a slightly better steering feel and effort. Again, I would say it's about 5% heavier. And also when you begin to make the turn like this, I'm just wiggling the steering right now. When you wiggle the steering, the immediateness or the reaction time to your hands moving the steering, it's, I would say, a little bit faster. I would say the 21 model, it's about 10% faster to react to your hand than the 2020 model. It's also slightly heavier feeling, and therefore, generally speaking, it's a tad, just a tiny bit more, perhaps better feel in terms of steering. In terms of ride and suspension, it's almost identical. I know they fine-tuned it a little bit more, and so I might say that the ride is maybe just a tiny bit smoother, but that could also be just difference in mileage between the two cars in terms of the tire wear. So I would say the ride is really almost pretty identical. It's very hard to tell the difference. I know that they made some suspension tuning so that in sort of a racetrack environment, the rear end won't come off as easily. It's a little bit more stable. Obviously, we can't do that testing right here in the city. So they have made some fine tuning of the adjustment. But again, day-to-day driving, on an everyday drive like this, is not noticeable in terms of difference. Maybe just a tiny bit, maybe, I don't know, maybe 5%. Suspension feels 5% more refined, and I might even add that it's slightly quieter, but that could be a number of other factors as well. I am driving the 2020 back to back with the 2021, so it is a direct comparison. I've been driving the new 21 model for several days now, and I own the 2020 model, so of course obviously I know that car very well. But both cars, of course, really are top-notch. It's as close as you can get to a pure sports car, and perhaps it's not quite as good as a Porsche 911 or Cayman, but those cars cost a lot more as well. So in this price range, it's really hard to beat the value that the Supra provides, and the amount of performance and the fun to drive factor they provides at this price bracket is absolutely shocking, amazing. Again, Tada-san, who is the chief engineer at Toyota, did a really amazing, super job of fine-tuning this car so that it provides the maximum performance and maximum joy to drive. So let me make a few more turns here, and I can show you a little bit more about the difference between the two cars. Yeah, so you can tell when you make a slightly sharper turn like this on the 2021 model, as you turn, you get a slightly faster reaction time between the steering and the actual car coming around the corner. So the car seems to be, it feels a little bit more glued to the road compared to 2021. The 2021 is a little bit more twitchy. It's a little bit more sensitive to your acceleration, your steering input. The 21 seems to have that slightly better balance. But I would say, again, the difference between the two is no more than 5% in the overall feel. If you take both cars to a track or a race circuit and drive around at a very high speed, you will probably notice more difference. But in an everyday city driving like this, most people will not notice the difference between the two years, the 2020 and the 2021. Otherwise, yes, both cars are just really fun to drive, and both cars are very forgiving in terms of ride. So you can definitely drive this every day as a daily car. It's comfortable, is surprisingly quiet except for the exhaust sound, which is very loud in the 2020, but quieter in the 2021 model. And so therefore it's actually very usable to and from work, or even from supermarket as an everyday car. Just kind of keep in mind that there's so much power and torque in these cars, and you can tell when I step on the gas a little bit here, you'll see it. Yeah, so you saw that you know, the road is actually pretty dry, but it's a little bit cold right now, and there's slight amount of dew, or a little bit of not rain, but just the wetness on the surface of the road, and the back end came off loose already. I didn't even step on the gas that much, maybe halfway. So again, you can use it day to day, but because there's so much power and torque, you just have to remember that it's not very good in rain or wet surfaces, and definitely it's probably not usable in the wintry, snowy condition. Even with the snow tires and winter tires, I think this car will be very hard to drive in snow. So it's very much a fair weather car, because the rear end keeps losing, the tire keeps spinning out in any slippery conditions. So it doesn't matter how much power and torque the car has, if you can't maintain a grip, you're not going to have fun, because the rear end will come off loose. So those are my basic summary of the two Supra, 2020 and 2021. If you are in the position to buy either one, it's very easy to decide actually if you want more power and slightly better refinement and slightly better steering feel. There we go. I step on the gas a little bit here and the rear end came off loose again. But anyway, yeah, so if you want slightly more refinement, slightly better steering feel, and you don't mind that the exhaust sound is quieter, then buy the 2021. Otherwise, if you can find a 2020 at a bargain price, or maybe even a used one, I mean, it's, you know, it's 98% identical to 21, and I don't know that the difference is all that noticeable on an everyday drive for an average driver. I'm a professional evaluation engineer, so I can tell the difference between the two, the minute differences, and I can tell that pretty well right away. But now that I've been driving both cars for several days back to back, I can tell you exactly what the differences are, which I pointed out now. But again, it's probably not worth necessarily paying more for 21. I'm definitely not upgrading my 2020 to 2021 because the difference isn't all that noticeable on a day-to-day drive. At the end of the day, both of these sports cars are amazing value for the price, for in terms of what they provide and the usability and the practicality. It's right up there among the best. I guess the only challenge I would say is that there's not much room or space in the car, and it's hard to get in and out. I'm not even that tall, and I still find it hard to get in and out of a car. So I would definitely classify this as a spring-summer car, a fair weather car, and you definitely want to have this as a second car if that's possible, and you know, have an SUV or some other more practical car for winter driving or rest of the year, and that would be the best combination. So amazing job Toyota for even coming up with this new generation Supra. We didn't think this was going to happen, but thanks to collaboration with BMW, both brands were able to reintroduce the two-door sports car, and it's really shocking that they have introduced cars this good for in this price range. So I look forward to continuing to drive both of these cars for several more days, and perhaps I will do another update. But for now, I will say the 21 is very impressive, but the 2020 Supra is almost as good, and I would say they're 95% identical.